Midnight at the Oasis. Send your camel to bed.
Good evening. You've reached the No Name Cinema Society, the film review show that dares to dig just a little bit deeper. And this is episode 89 as we continue our exploration of the films from the Oscar season of 50 years ago. That's 1974. And tonight's film for discussion is the film Gold, starring the incumbent James Bond of the time, Roger Moore. Hi, everybody. My name is Jonathan Betzlam, one of your hosts for the evening. I'm back in my home in Los Angeles for a quick trip, heading right back to New York City in a few days, where you'll see me next time. But first, I've got a couple panelists to discuss this film with me tonight. First, a handsome young man whose father owns a gold mine in New York City. Alexander Spears rejoins the show. How you doing, Alexander?
Golden.
You see what he did there, ladies and gentlemen? And also with us, a hotshot young engineer who also plays the guitar and banjo, singer, songwriter, rock star Mike Story is back.
Hi. Pleasure to be here.
That's the intros. What do I have next? Oh, it's the drinking slide. So this is the slide that you guys, the fans, sent us. Things that you drink to when we do them on the show. Obviously, Alexander and Mike are both newish, so they don't have anything on the list. But for me, anytime I say all-time diegesis contrivance, verisimilitude, you guys drink. Here is my drink for the evening. I don't know if anybody's drinking with me. I've got Elysian Space Dust IPA. It's kind of my go-to in Los Angeles. What about you guys? You got anything?
26 ounces of vodka.
I love that. Mike?
Got a little tumbler of some whiskey.
What? Can you tell me a brand? Maybe they'll sponsor us?
I have no personal sponsors, but I am drinking Johnny Walker Red.
Johnny Walker Red. Excellent. I know you don't have any personal sponsors, but I could sure use them, or the show could. So cheers, to you guys, and also to our listening audience. Before we get into the movie, per tradition, some quick notes on tonight's opening and closing song. This has actually been my favorite discovery, musically speaking, of the 1974 project. Midnight at the Oasis from Maria Muldaur tells the story of a love affair in the desert in a sultry, sweet way that puts me in just the right mood. It came on in the car the other day, and we were thinking of Corinne Bailey Rae and Norah Jones. This was by far Muldaur's biggest hit, but she did spend the rest of the 70s opening for the Grateful Dead. Midnight at the Oasis was the 13th biggest song of 1974. Either of you guys heard of this song before tonight?
I had not heard that song before. I knew some of her other work.
Oh, interesting.
I had heard that song and didn't know her other work.
There you go. You guys balance each other out. I kind of dig that. Speaking of songs, I mentioned on the last show that tonight's film received an Oscar nomination in the category of Best Original Song. Wherever Love Takes Me was written by Don Black and the great Elmer Bernstein. The vocalist on the track was Maureen McGovern, who was also the singer of the song that won the Oscar in 1974, We May Never Love Like This Again, from the Towering Inferno. Not only that, she also sang the Oscar-winning song from 2 years prior, Morning After, from 1972's The Poseidon Adventure. Bitch was the go-to woman for the Oscars if you wanted to win the song category. Her career quickly declined in the 70s, and she pivoted to musical theater, doing some Broadway shows here and there, and then dinner theater after that, which is essentially purgatory for ex-famous people. She was diagnosed with posterior cortical atrophy a couple years ago and has stopped performing. She now lives in a retirement community in Columbus, Ohio.
It's interesting. I hope she's doing all right, and when she watches this, that she knows that we're with her and all that.
All right, it's time to summarize tonight's movie. So, in case you didn't watch it, I can give you a little brief snippet of what it's about. We're talking about the film Gold. There is a multinational collective of rich guys who plot to sabotage a gold mine in South Africa to increase the value of their own gold. But they need a fall guy to unknowingly oversee the situation. They choose hotshot, ambitious young engineer Ray Slater, who is suspicious, but goes along until he can prove anything out of the ordinary. Had anybody heard of this film or seen it before watching it for this show tonight? No? Never even heard of it? All right, so with that, we'll go to opening thoughts. Alexander, what did you think?
I would say that there was a bit too much going on and not enough specificity.
We'll dig into that later. Mike Story, your thoughts?
It seemed like it's very much of its time. It reminded me of some of the themes that were going on around the same time in the 70s. And I like the fact that it was, in South Africa. It was kind of a cool, locale for a movie.
And my opening thought is, it was fine. And that's sort of where I'm at on this movie. And I'm not going to start with the most positive aspect like we normally do, but instead talk about the screenplay in order to explain further what I mean by it was fine. I was interested but not invested in this particular piece, and I think that has more to do with the lack of balance of plot and character. In this case, due to a complex narrative, the film leans into plot and the characters suffer. They are all kind of two-dimensional, even if they are occasionally charming, so I wind up not caring that much in the end, and that sort of aligns with a little what Alexander was saying, I think.
Yeah, I think that is a very accurate way of putting it, and we have to see what these gold miners are doing. That's all interesting and good, but one of the things that you have to do in that is find some way to connect all the characters so that we see sort of their baseline and then where they go to. I think most of the scenes are actually like two-person scenes, which is kind of weird when you have a bigger ensemble like that and people can kind of fade into the background a little bit too much. It's really interesting that the screenplay suffers considering it's written by the guy who wrote the book.
Mike, where are you at in this balance of plot and character?
Yeah, I take that point. We'll dig into it later probably, but it kind of reminded me of certain kind of like the sort of conspiratorial fear of like deep state stuff, cabals, and whether it's Marathon Man or like Conversation, this kind of like paranoia. Those films just kind of seem to be able to tie all the loose ends and like be a little bit more edited and directed in a more taut manner. And this didn't seem to really gel quite as well. For me, all the essential parts were there. Just something maybe, I don't know where the fault is, but it just didn't come together quite as well as those better films that I just mentioned.
And I think the answer is character development. The novelist here is making this choice, as Alexander pointed out, he wrote his own screenplay, so he's making this choice to tell the nuts and bolts of the story. It's, like we talked about, it's a complex narrative, so there's stuff he needs to get to, to explain things. And in the process, he loses track of like the reasons why we need to care. We need to care about the people. We're going to care about the thing. Like, that's my personal thing. And you talked about the paranoia of the Conversation, which is a great example because that is also from 1974. Another film, when you think about paranoia, like the ultimate paranoia film is The Parallax View. I don't know if anybody's seen that film, also from 1974. That's like paranoia on steroids kind of a thing. Do you know either of those films, Conversation or Parallax View, Alexander?
I don't know Parallax View. I've seen The Conversation a couple of times, and I'm a big fan of it. You think about that film, the worlds are a little bit smaller, so the two-person scenes make more sense, and you can see more happen in those. The world is so big in this one, when you think about the sheer size, and they do a really good job of showing the size of those gold mines and all that. But when you think about the number of people involved in that, you have to find a way to tie them all together. And I don't know that was done particularly effectively, other than the Cabal scene, and even then, it's like, here's these people I'm seeing for 5 minutes and I'll never see again.
So with that, I'm going to move on to talk about information in the screenplay a little bit. Something like this, mining in particular, doesn't come with a lot of a priori knowledge. And so the script and director need to collaborate to find ways to explain the actions of the characters and how things work. Some, not all, but some details were lost along the way to me. And I wasn't exactly clear on what was happening in some moments and why. They were asking me to take some things for granted. For example, I didn't understand in advance how the Panacea safety mechanism was going to work, and I would have liked to, especially for that final conclusion. The love story as well seemed lame and tacked on, forced and underdeveloped. I will say on the bright side, the story seemed really well researched, thorough and detailed on its subject matter, but that same level of detail didn't extend to the people themselves as characters. We talked about the balance of plot and character already a little bit, and this is almost an extension of that. With the plot, they didn't get into all of the details of the mining that would have been nice. With all the research they did, they lost track of character.
Anytime I'm watching this type of a film, like I kind of understand what the ultimate thrust of what the storytelling is trying to get at. I do just sort of see like the characters and the actors being used as pawns to like move that plot line idea forward.
Like, I didn't hate it, but I do feel like there was ways to make it better. Like, for example, if Roger Moore had enough of if something of a backstory that would explain why he was willing to go along. He knew right away that it was sketchy, but he, is that ambitious or something. But I didn't get any sense of that. You know what I mean? Like, okay. And, he certainly made some choices related to that relationship. Is she just another piece of hot tail, or is there something really special about her? I couldn't tell. Those are things that if I were revising the screenplay or giving notes to the writer, those are things that I would want to talk about. And certainly when directing a piece, I'm discussing these things with the actors, hoping to communicate them. Alexander, I don't know if you see my point at all on this.
I do. I'm tracking with it. I mean, I think that, like, for one, you have somebody come into a new world. That's a really easy way to use exposition to bury the entire functional part of how this mechanism works. They kind of give you this laundry list of things where, oh yeah, you're supposedly you've been really clean record since you got the newer jobs, but you're also divorced, you're paying a lot in alimony. Just give me this laundry list and I don't care about it because I don't see that it's meaningful. You end up with flat characters. And to go back to something you had said before, you do have to do a lot of work in something like this where I don't think anybody here has a thorough knowledge of mining. What's really important is of sort of getting us immersed in that world. Once we're in that world, we don't need to be told any more about it, but we need to know that the characters are there, that we see ourselves in them, and that they're dynamic. Roger Moore's a ne'er-do-well who still kind of is the same playboy at the end of it, right? He's kind of funny and he's kind of charismatic.
I wonder if there's another character in his career that reminds me of.
Yeah, I mean, I'd have to think about it, but
I'll give you 0.07 seconds to think about it.
The bigger question is, he was making some big assumptions, Mike, and assuming you do not know about gold mining in South Africa.
Yeah, I know. I'm a little offended by that comment.
I couldn't put it with such broad strokes. I'm sorry.
Mike's been all over. So I did want to ask you guys, though. I used the one example. Was it clearer to any of you guys about, like, what they talked about the safety mechanism that was going to solve, and like, oh, we need to cut down the safety mechanism? That was unclear to me until the very end when I saw it.
Yeah, I think they could have clarified it a little bit better, but my sense of it was that, like, the guys on the Vanguard, if they hit the water and it started flooding the cavern, the cavity that they were in, that there was a second set of explosives to blow up to essentially trap them in, but to protect everybody else and to protect the mine.
You definitely understood more than I got that. After
the fact. I guess I just know more about mining than you do.
I got someone on this show who does. Alexander, did you get that?
Yeah, that would make Mike the one of three who was clear on that. Like you, I figured it out when they were doing it and when it was happening. I was like, oh, okay, that's what he meant. You never want to insult the audience, but you also sometimes need to understand that we don't want to listen to a bunch of like highfalutin words, but we do want to know that we want to feel smart and like we understand the very complex world these people are living in. Tell it to a 7-year-old, that kind of simplicity. You do have to kind of simplify the language, and you have to really, in order to simplify it, you have to really understand it really well. And I don't know that it was as clear as it could have been.
Hey, I got it visually too. There's another 1974 movie that we watched just a couple nights ago as part of this project. Again, we're not doing an individual review of it. It's called Thunderbolt and Lightfoot with Clint Eastwood and Jeff Bridges, and they're robbing a bank, an armory. Yeah. They don't tell us, but they show us all the little like things that they use, and they make lists and they write down codes, and then it all comes together visually. And so it could have been done. I now know how to rob an armory.
What's the playbook?
Mike sort of saying he was like along for the ride. It tells its story, and it is mostly clear. Like, I think all of us understood the basic idea of what was going on. Mm-hmm. And so my notes here are really more just about additional depth, layering a little bit, so it could be even better.
Trying to find that balance between showing people visually, because we saw like the cable running and we saw that it got cut, but like maybe there needed to be just a little more telling. The show versus tell.
Show me setting it up, or show me as they set it up, him explaining it to a coworker that doesn't understand it. Both.
An offhand comment just being like, this is our fail safe that just like it sucks for the guy who's on the front line, but it saves the rest of us, or whatever thing.
Yeah, exactly. Because then we understand the stakes, right? Like in advance, that's tension. That's Hitchcockian example of suspense. Because the characters were underdeveloped, the performances were equally hollow. Not that most of these actors have a great track record in my mind. The biggest star of them all, historically anyway, is Ray Milland as the mine owner and father. He's an Oscar-winning actor from the 40s. I've always found him to be a false overactor that got worse and worse with age, proven by how he growls and bellows through the supporting performance. I personally don't, as I insinuated earlier, see any difference between Roger Moore's portrayal of Slater and his portrayal of James Bond, or even the Saint. Slightly less quips in this film, perhaps. I'm not even sure. It might be close. Of the cast, only Susannah York has any quality film work on her resume, but this role reduced her to the prototypical love interest character in a way that the Bechdel test would flag immediately. Alexander's our resident actor. I've got the three performances. Some of it's the script, but I do think there's moments that Ray Milland and Roger Moore really tanked.
So if the ceiling for the script is here, it's not going to go above that with the acting. I think, really, really good acting can really illuminate the stuff that's going on there, maybe even stuff that people don't realize that they're writing into that. But overall, you've got people who seem to be very okay with two-dimensional performances. If you're talking about the husband, does he actually care about his wife or not? That should be clear throughout. It should be clear if he's using her as bait, and it should be clear that he clearly cared about her at one point.
And independent of the script in some cases. Those are things that an actor can pull off without words.
I think Keegan-Michael Key says the space between the punctuation and the next line, you can fill with whatever you want to. You don't see enough behavioral stuff going on. When Roger Moore comes on, they list off this laundry list of bad things that he's got going on. You don't see anything come out of it. It's not like that guilt. There's no pileup of how ashamed I am that this is my life. There's no sort of half-hearted, well, shit, this is life kind of thing going on. It's just kind of it's very flat. I didn't see anything from anybody I was like, ooh, that's interesting.
I feel like I've already sort of expressed the way that I felt like overall about the way that the actors and their performances were used to propel the plot forward. Nobody jumped out to me. There was nobody that I latched onto. There was nobody where I like, that was a great performance. The father, what was the actor's name?
Ray Milland.
Yeah, he just, it felt like a stock thing. Like he came in from Central Casting. He's done this before. He's just kind of phoning it in or something like that. And the wife, she had very little, she was very two-dimensional. Roger Moore, I couldn't figure out. Yeah, it looked like it was some kind of iteration off of a Bond or something like that.
What these actors are not giving us is the clear point of view that they have. Mm-hmm. We don't know how he feels about it. Why? Because he's used to playing Bond, and Bond loves him and leaves him, About the clearest bit of moment actually is that does happen is Suzanne York at the beginning. It's very clear that she is into him. Even though I know it's a very kind of traditional setup on it. That is about the clearest moment because if I don't know how somebody feels, it makes it very difficult to be invested. In this, Roger Moore is our primary way into the story. He is doing the things and we are seeing it through his eyes. There's no point at which I get that he actually cares about anything other than money and sex. At least James Bond also cares about England,
Morality.
Yeah, morality, about honor, If you take away all of those redemptive qualities of James Bond, he's a charlatan, right? And that's what we have here.
Money and sex are my favorite things as well, so I don't know. I guess maybe that makes me a charlatan. For all that we're complaining, though, about these performances, and we've all complained at least a little bit, with performances that are this weak, including the normally amazing John Gielgud. If you can't get a great performance out of John Gielgud, then you're probably not a very good director. And that's my segue to talk about direction. And interestingly enough, this director did direct a Bond film, though not one with Roger Moore. Peter Hunt was the director on the infamous On Her Majesty's Secret Service. There is a weird connection there. When we did the screenplay, we talked about the intricacies of the plot. I intimated, as a director, Hunt can't quite keep all the complex facets of it in play. So clarity was lost along the way. So we know that Peter Hunt didn't really do much performance guidance, and he struggled to spin all the plates of the intricate narrative. So that's some misses there for him. However, the dry tone was at least consistent, and the framing/shot choices went beyond the basic shot reverse shot. There did seem to be thought put into the shots with a lot of foreground usage, high and low angles, and camera movement, though the in vogue zoom was perhaps overused, at least for me. He did try to force gold into the mise-en-scène wherever possible in a way that struck me as a little on the nose and obvious, but I like the fact that at least he's thinking about these things. It's more than a lot of directors would do, but it's about moderation. That idea was like a blunt instrument which limited its effectiveness.
There were some funny things that were a little too obvious, like you were saying the gold, but there was also like these like cut on idea things, or he'd be like, tomorrow we drill, and he'd like pour himself a glass of water. He's like really obvious things.
Some transitions, yeah. Like you can see what he's thinking, and you're like, no.
Yeah, like
a lot of the action direction in that suffers from too much cutting. The sort of best fight scenes you see are the ones that are unbroken, because it means that they understand all the steps, and you get really nice, there's a dance to it, there's a musicality to it. And it's not that, the Michael Bay cut is bad, that it can sometimes be used too much to cover a whole bunch of stuff that it doesn't. And so then you get shots that don't quite fit together. At one point, he's like going up a hill. The guy jumps up the hill, but then jumps back onto the hood of the car. And it's not justified at all. It had the feel of like not really being very well thought out at all.
Like, there was no internal logic to it all. Like, if you tried to ask somebody to say, pretend you're a wide camera shooting the entire thing, what happened? Please describe to me what just happened. That's why they had to cut it in all these unusual ways, because it's like people understand instinctually just like roughly how long a car is and how quickly a human being can move. And so it just defied our sort of innate sense of physics. And
that brings up a point that I was going to make, because he talked about the key to action scenes. I do think the Michael Bay scenes are bad. I've always felt like the key to action scenes is off-screen space. And what I mean by that is a director establishing where things are so that when you cut away from them, you are aware the distance, where things are in relation to each other, because you've seen that before. Sure. And Spielberg is the master of this. You look at the sequence in Raiders of the Lost Ark where he's chasing the truck, but you're constantly aware who's in front, who's in back, who's inside the truck. You're constantly aware of everything that's going on, and I think that, to me, is the key.
It's funny, you go to Raiders of the Lost Ark, I go to how visceral Saving Private Ryan is, and how you get immersed in that world, and that there's a thoughtfulness in, this is how I'm going to seamlessly sew together all of these parts of this sort of patchwork thing that I'm making, that is this scene, so that you do get the sense of how this is the space, right? It speaks to like a lack of cohesion on who these people are, what they want, why they're doing it, what is happening in the script, and just keeping that through line going throughout. And I to me, that is like it's a really easy touch point for why it's not a well-directed movie.
So we pretty much dipped our toe in this water at this point anyway, but I haven't officially announced the next segment. You remember what we call it, Alexander? That
T-word.
is a T, and we call it the T word. As many of you know, our founding member, Drunk Davey, used to hate talking about themes. The rest of us that did want to discuss the themes would dance around it and call it the T word. A segment was born. We sort of hinted about this a little bit. The film obviously takes place and was shot in South Africa, which is one of the more problematic countries on the planet, more so obviously in 1974. And yet, racism, colonialism, exploitation, and working conditions only exist on the periphery of this film, to my mind. Instead, I interpret it being more about old-fashioned corporate greed. It becomes such a cliche that it's almost laughable if so much of this behavior didn't actually go on. Rich megalomaniacs try to find loopholes in the capitalist systems to make themselves even richer, and with no regard for the lives or livelihoods of anyone impacted by their respective schemes. As a lifelong poor person, I've always had a hard time directing these characters, empathizing with their obsessive need for more when they have so much. If ever one of these films ever tried to understand that more, that would be a welcome change. Part of the benefits of capitalism, in theory, are the safeguards in place against such behavior. But in practice, those with financial might have the power to break or manipulate current laws or facilitate new ones to ease their path toward greater wealth. And the rest of us are left as insignificant pawns in their world plans, completely dependent on their whims and goals. I'm not sure this film or any film suggests any path outside of vigilance. The laws generally slow it to motion when it comes to closing the aforementioned loopholes, especially on a global scale such as this. But perhaps a greater expediency and adaptability to move quickly along with the technology amongst lawmakers might dissuade aberrant behavior such as depicted in the film, and perhaps balance the scales a little more. I've got corporate greed, Mike, as my theme number one.
I'm sure that's definitely there. I see it more like as something that was in the air because of Watergate, maybe, that tapped into a general kind of sense of conspiratorial sense of helplessness. You could totally put it through the lens of corporate greed if you want. It could also just be the idea that there's a special group of people who are pulling the strings, and I don't understand why they're able to do these things that I can't do, or I feel helpless. And like you could put that in like the conversation, Marathon Man. There's just some kind of this paranoia that the idea that there's just like, or even today they're talking about it, like talking about issues of deep state or something like that. And so I think that the movie tapped into that kind of zeitgeist. Conspiracy porn.
But in this case, certainly in this case, it is corporate interests that are, because this one doesn't seem to involve the government, or government cover-ups as directly. So I didn't get that sense. Now, maybe
fair enough.
There's an overall global distrust of authority and the relationship between the governments and corporate America for sure. I felt like it was a little narrower than that.
The particulars of this movie are definitely doing it. But so, yes, in that sense, it's absolutely correct. There's probably 40 movies made in 1974 that just tapped into that overall sense of creeping paranoia. The larger umbrella theme would be just that kind of sense of helplessness and not understanding complicated systems that you don't know about fully.
Alexander,
I mean, I would feel more comfortable with just greed.
You not want to offend your corporate friends?
My corporate overlords need to know that I'm on their side. Sponsored post. No, I mean in the sense that I think it's interesting to use the word corporate, obviously in the words of company, but also corporate meaning like a group of people, like that cabal. To Mike's point, the very thin veil that exists between corporate influence and political influence, the amount of distrust toward these big entities and the people who fill those roles, I think is something that is present in so many of these, late 60s, early 70s films, especially the early 70s ones, when you have the influence of Vietnam and just the growing distrust about, well, why are we really doing these things? Who really benefits from that? And I think, to your point about corporate greed, if you wanted a really easy touchstone for that, the sort of commodification of the worker, I would be fine calling it corporate greed. I feel like there's a better, more encompassing word that's not coming to me right now.
Well, I've got another theme too that maybe ties into that a little bit.
Any kind of board, any kind of corporate entity is composed of people. And so when I hear things like corporate greed, I'm just thinking it's like the coalescence of individual greed corporately.
To your point, it takes a lot of people to sign off on something this immoral, but they did. And
yes.
They do. I think I said in my essay, I don't understand it. I have a hard time directing this because I have a hard time understanding the need for more. Is it overcompensating for something? Because these people are already rich. So what is it that they don't have or need? Yeah. In this film, that's unclear.
Power's got to be a hell of a drug because it seems like people are just very unwilling to give it up.
And if it is about power, then show me that as a filmmaker. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I think you need to take the time to explicate that a little bit. But my other theme is, Roger Moore's presence in this film made this further interesting to me because I don't know if you guys noticed this, but this film basically has the same plot as Goldfinger, the James Bond film that we reviewed in episode 71.3. The nuts and bolts of the plot are exactly the same, although Auric Goldfinger's plan in that film was perhaps a little more grandiose and creative, where he tried to make Fort Knox radioactive in order to increase the value of his own gold. Like, it's exactly the same. But it reminded me of what I said on that show when we reviewed the film in episode 71.3. In their own ways, both films point out the systemic flaw that the value of an object is somewhat arbitrary. Gold has value because of its rarity, and if someone makes it even more rare, it adds value to its stock. That's the theory that everyone's operating behind. People want it for things because why? It looks pretty or adds cachet, but those are societal concerns. Things like oil and coal have a very everyday value, but gold is a luxury. If we opted as a society not to need or want gold, it would lose value regardless of how rare it is, and as a result, minimize the crime, scheming, and in some cases, casualties that go along with the pursuit of it. The same thing could be said for diamonds or any other so-called precious metal. I do think that was on the mind of the novelist and probably the filmmakers at some point, but leaving all those aforementioned themes, racism, colonialism, etc., on the table seems short-sighted. And that's another reason why this watchable film languishes in the mediocre middle for me, but I do think that's what the plot, the nuts and bolts of the plot, had me thinking about. Alexander, global economics, in this idea of how we value precious metals.
It's interesting. Diamonds are valuable because they're rare, but also because they're very strong, so you can cut other things with them. Quote, it's a lyric, Lupe Fiasco, it's something to the effect of, truth be told, the pursuit of gold turns the goals of men into trash, or something like that, What is this thing that almost has people like palpably lusting over it, right? This allure of the rare qualities, just because we prize it so heavily. Because it's a rare, precious metal, but because we prize it so heavily, it turns the world into something where we're pursuing that at the expense of other things that are probably more important, that are probably, not to get sentimental, but more important in terms of lasting than a golden band would be. Why does my desire for something turn into the exploitation of another? Pointing a finger of it doesn't absolve us of guilt in this. We're all complicit in this in some levels. I do think it is important to have a conversation around it.
What I don't understand is I don't need anything to be gold. Personally, for me, I don't care. I would like the rest of you out there not to care either. But Mike,
I'm not going to try to weigh in anymore on the morality play aspect of what it was trying to do, and I think it just kind of didn't really succeed. At the end when they try to give King's gold helmet to Roger Moore, and he's like, "I can't stand the stuff," or whatever he says. It's like, okay, yeah, but we don't even know what you do like.
Right.
We don't know what your moral compass or your code is. At the end, it's all sound and fury signifying nothing. It's trying to virtue signal about something, but yet it has no alternative that it's presenting.
Yeah,
that's a great point about the no alternative, and that is a flaw, because we talk about that all the time. And I admit that sometimes when we do these T words, I mean, some of these themes are aspirational, meaning these are things that is sort of there that they did not bring out enough. So this is definitely, it failed from that point of view. I feel that it felt worthwhile to mention because. It could have been a bigger element, and it could, it maybe should have been, but it is something I was thinking about as a result of watching the film. All right, guys, so it's time for me to wrap things up. So that means it's time for closing thoughts. Mike,
you don't need gold, folks.
I agree. Me and Mike don't need gold. Maybe in our teeth. Alexander, closing thoughts.
I think what makes a film like this really disappointing is all the potential to deliver, and just almost seeming like in a lot of places the wrong scene was filmed or the wrong bits of dialogue were used. It underdelivers on something that honestly could have been a really fascinating movie.
We feel like it's worse than something like The Land That Time Forgot because the potential was greater here, maybe.
Yeah, it's not campy. This one is kind of like a more serious Bond flick.
That's actually great way to sum it up, because so that we'll close there. From the mining fields in South Africa to the actual minefields of the World War II era occupied French countryside. Next up for us is one of the films nominated for Best Foreign Language Film at the 1974 Oscars, Le Comme Lucien, from French maestro Louis Malle. And that's the next film up for discussion on the No Name Cinema Society. For that, however, I want these guys to say goodbye to the audience. They're waving for those of you listening on Spotify and iTunes.
Bye-bye.
Trust me. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, this 89th meeting of the No Name Cinema Society is adjourned.
Midnight at the oasis, sing your camel to bed. Got shadows painting our faces and traces, a romance in our